Hello, I am an AI developer, and I'm going to give you some opinions on what I think about AI, why you should listen to me or not. I'm what I call a tier one AI person, and I put them in three big blocks. Tier one are the people that use APIs to access large language models like GPT-4, Claude, or Gemini, names of some big models, to build applications. That's where mostly I am. Tier two would be the people who can take those models by big tech, fine tune them, or open source models, fine tune them with their own data, and create something based off something existing, but to make it more into their use case. That's a tier two. And then the tier one people are the people that are, probability and statistics, AI mathematicians actually build large language models from scratch. I will never be one of those people at this stage in the game of my life, but I can kind of get into this tier two space and I'm comfortable in this tier one space. So I do work professionally as an AI developer. So am I good? I don't know. I see a lot of great people. Anytime you get into technology, there's always uh, just a lot of talent there. And if you compare yourself all the time, you'll drive yourself nuts and suffer what they call imposter syndrome. Look it up. So I just kind of do my thing, try to do as good a job as I can, and so far that's worked for me. But you know, there's just so many brilliant people out there that are making such great stuff. You know, I'm down here. So anyway, what I want to talk about is a couple pet peeves that I've had. Let's talk about AGI. Everyone's trying to define what artificial general intelligence is, and then trying to define when we reached it. To me, that's a total stupid argument because it either is or it isn't, and depending on how you define it, just it's noise to me. What is of value is a new revolutionary technology entering into our society and how that kind of progresses on the slope of adoption and seeps into daily life all the time. And then to get, initially it goes for all the low hanging fruit that it can do easily. And then once it gets here, this other stuff that's more hard, it's a little bit slower going in. And again, with artificial intelligence, there's all sorts of research and stuff done. So I do think there's limits to how transformer-based large language models like ChatGPT, they might, you know, right now I think we're probably more like right here, but we could start getting to the point where getting the extra stuff is a little bit harder, but still, there's just so many use cases for artificial intelligence that are it's just it's the transformer stuff is in large language models based on that is relatively new. It's going to seep into life all over the place. That to me is much more interesting how it impacts the average person rather than just making up a definition and then arguing if we're there or not. So the average person's heard about AI. They might have a friend or do it themselves who does like AI art or AI music and maybe rarely AI video. Um, so they're aware of it, but just how much are they aware of it is kind of the question. And I think we're hitting to the point now where they're aware that, maybe some of the robocalls that they get might be AI driven. Some of the decision making that they deal with when dealing with corporations and stuff, they're vaguely aware that there might be some AI component to that. Probably at work, maybe they're just now starting to use, they've been using maybe ChatGPT to help them write emails and stuff like that. And that's just gonna, all this stuff is gonna bleed more and more into society. And then we have robotics, which I thought would be farther along. Robotics is just getting going. Like technically we have C3PO now because you can take a droid and then plug ChatGPT into it for its mind, but they're not really linked. The mind's not really too linked with the motor skills of the robot, except for companies like Tesla and others that are doing that. But you could basically take like, a doll and hook it up to ChatGPT and it could chat with you, but it couldn't like move. So the idea is to pair both of them together, and there's all sorts of research to that. But I think that's going to lag more than I thought. But as far as the daily seepage into everyday life, that's what I'm watching, and that's a much more interesting question than whether we hit some milestone or whatever. Now, I would argue that artificial superintelligence is something to watch. You know, in some ways, with the AI LLMs, we've already hit artificial superintelligence, but it's narrow, it's not broad. You know, it's like companies like DeepMind at Google are using it to go overall, you know, come up with hundreds of thousands of potential compounds and then evaluating them so human researchers can say, well, for this task, this compound might be useful. So we're going to start researching that. Your average PhD would spend hundreds of years doing that. And we have this AI technology that's doing it for us right now. But that same AI model, you might ask it a stupid question and it probably would brick on it. So it's narrow, its use case. And already we're seeing those far supersede what humans could do, I would argue. But when you get like ASI general, where you have a large language model that can do things better than almost every human alive, almost all things, and then it can even start reprogramming itself to be even better. That's something that could happen. And I think it maybe even it is behind closed doors, and I would be watching that very heavily. That's so adoption and a little bit of worry about artificial superintelligence are the things that I would focus on. Um, and then there's the whole what I call gradient of usefulness, and that's basically if you're worried about AI starting to replace you and stuff, you want to make sure that you're because generally the type of jobs and stuff, without getting into it too much, that could be replaced, it's always going to hit the low-hanging fruit first. So I think if you're good at what you do, um, and you use AI as a tool to supplement what you do, you're golden. And but if you're just kind of putzing along, not doing something that really requires a lot of brain work, especially if it's a lot of the same pattern, if you're just kind of doing a pattern over and over again, AIs can watch that. And if it's knowledge-based work, if you're at office work or doing a pattern that's not very complicated, I would worry because eventually this stuff as it seeps into society, even ignoring the hype, you know, it's like one day it's like, oh yeah, I hear about AI. I got a friend that does AI art, blah blah blah. Next couple months, it's like, oh, there's this Chat GPT thing. I'm going to try it out to help me write emails and stuff. And then boom, they're using it at work. And then boom, I hear the IT department's using it to detect anomalies in our network and all this stuff. It's just slowly seeping into things, and it'd be interesting to watch how it gets more deeper into things because whether regardless of all the promises and claims that are made by the AI hucksters, I'll call them, this getting into society slowly, it's a revolutionary technology and it'll go in width and in height as far as it pushing into our lives. So that to me is something to watch. And it'll be a slow creep regardless of the height. Again, that it's going to go for the low hanging fruit. So if you can increase your value proposition to be in the stuff that's not so patterned, that takes a little bit of critical thinking. It's going to take longer, if even ever, AI can get to the point where it can replace that 20% or 10% or 5%. And that chunk of value add, I think AI is going to have trouble overcoming or replicating. I mean, it will, but it'll slow down. So if you're worried about jobs and stuff, you want to get into that high value add and using AI for you rather than worrying about it replacing you is good. Um, so I think as a society, it's kind of decision time though, because what we have is we have a form of corporate fascism. Basically, that I'm just going to say it how I see it. You can disagree with me, but here it is. You have corporations that, or you have government that wants to push a morality on the general populace. But because of the Constitution, it can't really do that. But what it can do is it can build partnerships with big businesses. And since America and much of the Western world and much of the world in general is become oligarchical, meaning that you know, in any business sector, there's like three big players and then maybe four or five smaller players, but those three big players control such a huge chunk of the market that they effectively control things. And if as governments become a little bit more socialist and control a greater amount of the GDP of an economy, these big tech companies have to play ball, especially as governments become more powerful. It can mess with their business and do all stuff, and the constitutional protections or parliamentary protections or whatever in the country you're at kind of weaken. These uh, big players want to play ball, and there's interlocking directorates between governments and these corporations, and so the agenda no longer goes from government to you; it goes from government to corporations, and then the corporations push down on you. So the government's not saying, "Hey, you can't render that in DALL-E 3." It's OpenAI or whoever that's putting the stops on it, saying, "Oh, this is against our policies." The government's not saying, "Oh, you can't say that because that's hate speech." It's whatever social media platform deciding that that's hate speech, and since they're quote private, they can go ahead and regulate you how they feel. So that's how fascism is kind of going to do an end run about around constitutional um, and other protections. And why I bring this up is because we have a decision time. AI LLMs are transformative. They're going to seep in. Their usage is going to seep into every area of life. Do we want to make sure that those LLMs aren't too controlled? Like yeah, basic examples like when Chat GPT 3.5 came out. I'm not talking about your politics. I'm just saying if you said sing a song about Trump's accomplishments, it would go, sorry, I can't do that because of blah blah blah. Sing a song about Joe Biden's accomplishments. Sure, here's a glowing song about Joe Biden. I mean, there's bias built in. There's bias because of this corporate fascist thing that's going on to get around protections. And if you're on a certain political spectrum, you're you're getting, you can still be quote say conservative, but you can't be that kind of conservative. You have to be in this box, and over time the box is going to get smaller and drift more towards the middle, or you're far out um, liberal, but the box again, even for you, though I'd say you have much more freedom right now. But even there, your box, if you start deviating from the plantation of ideas, I'll call it, the box is going to get squeezed. Do we want to have corporations be able to do that to us? And it's a big question, especially with AI. Um, and now they're wanting to start regulating open source models. And again, this is never coming from the US. It's always somewhere in Brussels or some international thing to come in and try to, oh, we got to make AI safe. A large language model giving me false info is like problem. It's a problem, but it's like problem 365 on my task of what the most important problems are. But if you want to regulate dissent and not allow people to think for themselves, then there might be some pressure to push that up to like number one. Oh my gosh, it might teach you how to create something bad. It's like if you're any bit technical, you can get on the internet and probably find out anything that they're worried about a large language model teaching you. Now, again, large language models might come into more prominence where they're in front of you and it's easier to get that stuff. So I don't know. I'm not saying necessarily completely regulation free, but I would like it that way and put it more on the onus of what you do. With AI safety, I use this example of the Nuke API. You would not want to give me an API application programming interface where I can press a button and launch all the nukes that the US has at China, Russia. At the same token, you would not necessarily want to give an AI LLM that API where it's watching things and it decides when to do. The problem really isn't AI. The problem is who has control of this resource. And the same filters that you'd put to keep people who aren't qualified from controlling a resource you might want to put on AI as well. Um, but it's not necessarily an AI problem, it's a resource control problem. If that makes sense, am I making sense? I hope I am. Um, so there's this big push to kind of regulate AI, which I think is way overdone. There are open source models out there that aren't regulated or less regulated. And I think we have to decide as a society, are we going to let big tech companies and government working together kind of put the boundaries on what we're allowed to think? Or are we going to do what our ancestors, at least in America, did and said, no, we're sovereign citizens. We'll think for ourselves. There's no ministry of truth here. We'll decide what to think. In America, there really isn't any definition of hate speech either. Not that I'm advocating you go out and talk a bunch of trash and hate and all that. I'm not. But I'm just saying is that sometimes you might have a fringe idea. Like, let's say there might be some evil people in the world that get together and push certain agendas and shape them like they're doing it for the kids or they're doing it to save the environment. But really, what they're doing is trying to pass legislation that enriches themselves because they've prepositioned to benefit if that legislation is passed. And they're just using mind psychological operations on you to make you think that if you don't do this, you're not a good person. And if you take the bait, you just give them more power and take away power from yourself. And to think that that isn't going on, I would argue, is a bit naive. Um, so I think it's time for society that we need to start pushing back against all this regulation, especially when it's not even coming from our own country. It's coming from uh, countries that don't have the same traditions of free speech and freedom that we do. Um, what else can I talk about? Wrote a couple notes. Oh, the idea of prompt engineering. Like, I thought prompt engineering was a joke. Initially, you heard stuff about people making, you know, oh yeah, you make $300,000 a year if you're an English major and you don't need any technical background at all, and you can just learn how to prompt. And I laughed. Now, were there any cases of that ever existed over the last year? I'm sure there were a few. But when my relatives were bringing this up, I started looking at some of the specs of jobs that were, quote, prompt engineering. And there was a whole lot of other stuff that came with that. It wasn't just that you knew how to massage the questions and do various techniques, one shot, multi shot, jailbreaking, and stuff like that to get what you want, or counter jailbreaking too, to get what you want out of a language model. There was a whole bunch of other skills like, oh yeah, do you know how to write software too? No, that's just the fine print. So no English major with no, like, are there opportunities out there? There are, like, for non-technical people to jump on something and gain lucrative stuff. Especially like I had a relative that was applying at one of the big studios for essentially AI safety and compliance, and it kind of dovetailed in with DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff. And they were just reeling out boatloads of money potentially for people to fill those positions in big global tech or big movie studios and stuff like that. And they didn't necessarily want technical requirements. So I guess that stuff's out there. But for most of us, it's probably going to be like when someone talks about prompt engineering jobs. Um, it really means prompt engineering plus your your other software development type skills. Um, One of the things that I will say though is prompt engineering is a real discipline though. You have to, and it's not a uni thing. Like certain techniques might work with one model or types of models or families of models that might work less on other models. And using emotion and jailbreaking techniques and um, all sorts of stuff to have models do things. Like you hear stories about, like, if you say, give me this information, if you do a great job, I'll give you a $100 tip, and you're prompt to an LLM, and it actually works. It'll give you a slightly better result sometimes. And there's negative emotions too. You can say, if you don't do this, then you're blah 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 blah, and the LLM might respond even more positively or negatively. There's a whole bunch of nuances in that. So I'm not going to just, like, I used to just exclude prompt engineering as a thing, but no, it is a thing. And if you really dive deep, you can get that extra 5 to 10% performance out of a model, 5 to 10% accuracy, 5 to 10% avoiding um, partially hallucinated information and stuff like that, and know how to detect it and go against it when outputs happen. Know how to get it more of the consistent. Um, that's a real skill. So prompt engineering is a thing, but it's just not the way people talk about it. And then some of the last thing I'll talk about, and this thing's fascinating to me, is the whole problem of the dark forest. Basically, what happens is everybody becomes wants to sit at home like I'm doing right now, hit a button, and then it just goes out. AI goes out, produces all sorts of content, blogs, videos, social media posts, and it's all AI. And then you have another person over here doing the same thing. And then essentially what happens is we're just gumming up the internet works. We're just pumping out information rather than us talking to each other. Now, more and more, it's AIs talking to AIs. And sometimes we even using AIs as barriers to filter all the other AI content to just give us what we want, and it just gumming up the works. Like, what does that mean? And then the AI that was training on good human content, that good human content becomes less and less of a percentage of the web. So now it's all kind of based on synthetic data that mirrors essentially a cutoff point where humans were the primary driver of information creation. And then after that point, it's all AI just based on what they did. And yeah, humans driving information creation will always be a thing, but it'll become a smaller and smaller chunk on the pie. So as you're training, you're just kind of training on what's already been done and you're just kind of reforming it, but the real innovation and stuff that creates new training data, the humans become more less and less. So your data that you need to produce innovation in LLM tech becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. It's kind of like almost watching The Matrix where Agent Smith says something like, this was the pinnacle of your civilization was right about here. I mean, we could kind of be that point information wise. And then what happens is the internet's still fun when all you do is get on and it's all just gummed up uh, AI. When you call somebody on the phone, it's all AI. It's a brave new world that we're heading into, and it's going to be really fascinating to see. I'm not saying it's going to happen overnight, but I saw some astonishing statistic, like on GitHub, like how much of the code supposedly is written by AI. It's higher than you think. It's like 40%. I know in my job, I have AI write code all the time. Now, I have it write the little simple chunks. And then I take those simple chunks or functions or whatever, and then I plug them into bigger, complex things that I'm thinking about. But, a lot of times now it's not even worth my effort to like try to retain all this knowledge about how to do certain things. I just go, oh, I want to do this. Do I know it off the top of my head or kind of, maybe not? I type it in, it gives me some samples. What's really frustrating though is sometimes it's still at this moment in time, it's easier to just go through the documentation and figure out yourself. I'd say about 60% of the time when I do this, I get a good answer from the AI. It works, and I can just kind of use it as is. And then there's another 10, 15% where it doesn't really work. I've got to iterate a couple times, and then it will work, and then I can use it. And then there's that last chunk, whatever it is, um, that you just go down this dark rabbit trail where the AI is full of crap, and you just waste so much time that you regret just not looking through the documentation trying to figure it out yourself. And I'm trying to get good at trying to head things off at the pass where it's like, okay, I'm hitting something. And again, knowing how to ask the right question is critical too, because if you're not asking the right questions, AI doesn't have. I mean, it's trained on all sorts of information. But when you ask it a question, it doesn't always have the context of what exactly it is that you're asking. Um, like it doesn't act like I got a programming question. The AI won't act like a 20-year veteran of software development. So when I ask and I'm talking in a stupid question, um, it's not even the right question. It's like, oh my gosh, and then AI just puts you down a dark rabbit hole and you never figure it out. Um, so I don't know where I was going all with all that. But yeah, the dark forest of, just gumming up the works. What does that mean for our society? You know, do we create little fortresses away from AI where we can have human interaction? Will we even know when we're interacting with a human or not? Will we eventually even care? You know, all very interesting questions. I don't think it'll get to the point. Well, I don't know. All very interesting stuff. But anyway, I'm getting done here. I just remembered I got to do something for work, so I'm gonna log off. And um, yeah, I'm kind of fooling around because I was up till 4 o'clock one night, 2 o'clock another night, working on some stuff. And I'm pretty fried today, and I don't want to mess anything up, so I'm just kind of me. Anyway, hopefully, my thoughts were useful. Carry on. It's an exciting time to be alive for sure. It's a perilous time, possibly. I mean, there's so many different directions societies could go right now. And it's a real shame that they would go negative because there is the potential for a lot of positive things to happen. But just in our human nature, we tend to screw that up. But even screwing it up, still some good will come. And I hope you position yourself to be in that area where the good is coming and avoid getting stuck where all the bad's going to fall. Good luck.